So in preparing for this conversation, I remembered the words of the late Binyavanga Wainaina. He was a fiction writer in Kenya, and he said in his book, How to Write About Africa, this is an excerpt, broad brushstrokes throughout are good. Avoid having the African characters laugh or struggle to educate their kids or just make do in mundane circumstances. Have them illuminate something about Europe or America in Africa. African characters should be colorful, exotic, larger than life, but empty inside, with no dialogue, no conflicts or resolutions in their stories, no depth or quirks to confuse the cause. And this is how I want to begin the conversation, Tomi. Why do you think it's so important that we should be talking about how Western outlets cover the global South?
Good question. I think because Western outlets are bigger, they have a bigger reach, and they affect the way the world sees the rest of the world. And so most times when people want to confirm something, they Google, and the first thing that pops up is probably a New York Times or BBC or Guardian or whatever article. And sometimes people are not going to read 10 articles before they shape their view of a place. They will read the one or two, couple of headlines they see, and then they build from that. Or they turn on the TV and they look at these big cable channels, and then that's what they use to shape their ideas. And it's not just the global South, it's also how we see the rest of the world. We still turn to these big media. And if these big media outlets are not getting the story right, then we, the rest of the world, are getting a wrong view of these places that we're trying to learn about.
Alessandra, you're sitting in a very unique position where you sort of have this very large footprint across the globe. How would you assess Western coverage of the global South if you were to grade them A, B, or C? A being excellent and C being average.
Oh, yeah, thank you. Well, first of all, I think this is a really important topic, so I'm glad we are talking about it. I mean, I really, I can talk more about what we do just because I feel that we are in a unique and privileged, I would say, position because we've always had a global view. We are reporting in 200 places around the world, and we feel it's our responsibility to seek the full picture, and not just with a sort of a global connecting of the dots, but with expertise on the ground. And this is true everywhere. And apologies if my audio is a little strange. I hear something coming back to me. And I want to point out, for example, just today, where we published this incredibly moving and powerful account. I'm hearing something strange, apologize. From Ethiopia, about sort of the thousands of Tigrayan.
Alessandra, unfortunately, your video is breaking. I think we'll get back to you shortly. But Barkha, do you have any comments regarding this, sort of assessing how Western outlets view the global South?
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. I think the problem with how the West looks at our countries in the global South is embedded in the framing of this morning's conversation. Who cares about disasters abroad? Basically, it means that every time you're looking at us through the lens of disasters. And if there isn't a disaster, you're looking for the exotic, the kooky, the odd, it's almost as if we're not regular people with regular textured, complex, many shades of truth lives. And let's be very clear what this conversation is about. It's about the asymmetry of power. This is a conversation about power. This is not just a conversation about journalism. This is a conversation about countries that have traditionally wielded power and therefore defined and often manipulated the narrative. And I was very sort of intrigued to hear, yes, a number of big media organizations have boots on the ground in multiple countries, but having presence doesn't necessarily alter your gaze. You're still looking at our countries, at our people, at our multiple truths, through the singularity of a narrative that is almost what Edward Said once called Orientalism. It is a way of looking at us in which you think you're holding a mirror up to us, but when we look at that mirror, we don't see ourselves.
David Beasley, I'd like to come to you because the question of who cares about disasters in the global South directly affects to the work that you're doing. What do you think is one of the most probably undercovered or underreported issue that's currently ongoing?
Food security is probably your biggest issue the world is facing right now, and I think the West has really done a pretty lousy job in the last 5-6 years on that. You know, I was really hard on a lot of my friends in the media in the last 4 or 5 years. You turned on Western media in the last 4 or 5 years, it was 90% Trump, 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 or Brexit, 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 or COVID, 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 COVID. Regardless of your views on that person or those issues, the coverage of the people that are struggling around the world and the amount of hunger that's rising around the world, we've seen, and I'm not talking about chronic hunger, I'm talking about, very serious people marching to starvation hunger has gone from, when I arrived at this job 5 years ago, it was 80 million people. Then it jumped to 135 million people right before COVID. And then with COVID, it jumped from 135 million to 276 million people. And now it's at 350 million people marching towards starvation in in countries around the world. And within that, you've got 50 million people knocking on famine's door in 45 countries. Now, if I begin to explain that you got every 4 seconds someone dying from hunger, why in the world would that not be front page news in every newspaper and media outlet, radio and television and smartphones and social media in the world?
Let me ask.
I mean, it's just preposterous.
David,
If we don't get a handle on this, it's not just a nation with poverty and starvation is impacted. The entire world is impacted. And this is what I've really tried to do in the last 3 months with Ukraine. You cannot ignore the rest of the world while you focus on Ukraine.
All right, before we get to
People
Ukraine,
are starving to death
David, I need to ask Tomi a question.
In Somalia and Ethiopia and the Sahel, and I could go on and on. But anyway, the fact that the world is starting to cover global food crisis is great news. The bad news, it should have been done 10 years ago, because if you don't have food, people and children die and they lose hope.
All right.
And they join ISIS or Al-Qaeda or Boko Haram or extremist groups and exploit and destabilize nations. In the next 1 to 2 years are going to be 2 of the most catastrophic years in world history, particularly and especially in our lifetime.
David, if you can hear me, I really need to ask Tomi a follow-up question before you move to a secondary thought. The points that David is making are very clearly articulated, but the question is, why aren't these headlines in the global south? Because why are we so reliant on Western media to cover our issues?
We aren't. Sorry, that was for Toby. But
yeah, but you can go ahead.
I'm so sorry. There's an assumption in this conversation that there's a we. There isn't a singular we. And that's the whole problem with this conversation. There is an assumption, because of the asymmetry of power, that every enlightened thought belongs to the West. That is then overseeing the rest of the world and telling us what is the problem with our human rights record, what is the problem with our foreign policy, what is the problem with our structural inequalities, what is the problem with the place of women in our societies, which is not to say that all of these things are not problems, and that it is not the job of us as journalists to ask all of these questions. But I think as an Indian, it really bothers me that what New York Times and Washington Post, where I have a column, say about my country's, let's say, record on the safety of women is going to be held up as the truth that the world is going to pay attention to. But what I have to say about the failure of, let's say, the Americans to mandate COVID vaccines or to contain gun control or to not give their women a right to reproductive autonomy, that's not going to be considered the narrative. So let's acknowledge that there isn't a we. This we is being foisted on us.
But yeah, Tomi, how did we get here?
100%. I think it's also this idea, this superiority complex, that if I see something, it happens, and if I don't see it, it doesn't happen. I mean, if there was a fight outside this room and a few of us went out and saw it, and I come back in and I tell you, oh, I'm the first Nigerian to witness that fight, you must think that's absurd. But that's how Western media go around talking about exclusive. And we carry this exclusive tag as if it's some trophy, when actually it should be a shameful indictment of how poorly spread our coverage is.
Alessandra, I really want to clap for that point because I think it was very well articulated. Yeah. Thanks. Alessandra, how do we fix this? Because, as I said, Reuters has a footprint all over the world, and I'm sure the people who are in these areas are local journalists. So why is the coverage not reflective of this?
Okay, thank you. And I apologize for before. So I just want to finish one point that you said at the very beginning, and I promise I'll move on. As a journalist, I hate it when people don't answer questions, but you said something at the very beginning, which was people go in when there's a big moment or crisis, all the Western or every media organization piles in and then leaves. And I think this is an important point, which is you can't cover an issue, a country, an event, unless you are there before, you're there at the moment, and you're there afterwards. And I think that this is sometimes what happens with media organizations. You pile in because it's the moment, because you don't want to get scooped, because everybody is there, and then you leave. And we believe that, I personally believe that, covering something, any issue, but by being there consistently and understanding it, even when there's no big, global story, is very important. But to your point, I think that we have put a lot of things on the table right now, and I think maybe unpacking a couple of them. There is how the Western media organizations, as you were saying, cover the world, and certainly, we consider ourselves a global news organization with no nationality. And I think that's what we try to do. We are not reflecting the point of view of one government. We are not covering the world for one point of view or for one audience. And do we get it right every time? No. But what we try to do is we have this concept that we call glocality, which is that we have a global connecting of the dots, a global point of view, but with local journalists on the ground. We hope that that brings a level of sophistication and understanding that can't be had by someone who parachutes in and just sort of does a very cursory view of what is going on. Or, as you were saying before, oh, this happened, I'm going to talk about it, I'm going to report it, without really understanding the background. So that is for global media organizations. But another way to fix it is the issue of helping local news organizations. A lot is talked about in these years about how difficult it is for local news organizations, wherever they may be, to thrive for financial reasons. So another part of this puzzle is ensuring that local news organizations in any country are able to thrive, because of course that's where you get the true deep global knowledge. A third point, and then I'll be quiet, but a third point is there is a lot of talk also now about contractors and freelancers, and how big media, global media organizations are relying more and more on people on reporters on the ground who are not on staff. And there's a big issue now about how they are treated financially, how you keep them safe, how you protect them legally if something goes wrong. And I also think that is part of the solution. And then finally, last point, and then finally, I think especially for global news organizations, the diversity within the newsrooms, so that there's a sensibility that is not just the sensibility, again, of one country or one point of view. I think these are 4 issues that can help or begin to help tackling the issue.
Okay, so Alessandra has already gone into some of the things that we can do to shift this, but David had started talking about the impact of underreporting or misreporting these regions. And David, I just want to come back to you because you had talked about mushrooming terrorism sort of as a byproduct of misrepresentation.
We lost.
David, can you hear me?
Yeah, we lost you there for a second. You said something about talking about terrorism as a byproduct, then I lost you.
Right. So I was asking about the implication of poor coverage of the Global South. How does it affect the decisions that are made, for example, at the World Food Programme?
Yeah, a big time, Edith. And it's absolutely critical that media get it right and they get the balanced coverage about what's really happening around the world, not just what's happening in Ukraine, not just what's happening in the United States, et cetera. And when we get the media coverage right, here's what happens. Political leaders respond. I can give you story after story. For example, 60 Minutes We knew we had a high data port crisis when it was being blockaded by the coalition years ago. And we had 60 Minutes come in and do an absolutely devastating story on the impact. It entirely moved the American and the European people, which in turn caused the political leaders in the West to respond immediately. The same thing occurred literally about 6 weeks ago with the Odessa port. I couldn't get the media coverage to ramp up the reality that we were facing. Everybody was focused on just what was happening inside Ukraine with a little bit of with the migration taking place in Europe. And we were trying to let the world know that you're going to have a global food crisis if you're not careful, if you don't open up that port. Well, 60 Minutes and many other major outlets began doing the proper coverage, which enlightened the political leaders around the world to respond, which is absolutely critical, because the media plays the most vital role of informing the public. And if the media is not informed adequately in a more balanced way, then we don't get the reaction from political leaders that's necessary to bring the change that we all know needs to happen. So, and I could give you more stories, but Edith, you get the point right here.
Yes, I do. Thank you. So Barkha, coming back to this question of journalists and how they're deployed in sort of local outfits, they are, rather, do you think that there's an element of them being used to tell a story and a narrative that has been formulated elsewhere?
I think I'm so glad that the point has been raised about what are called freelancers or stringers or fixers. There are different nomenclatures for them, and the language itself, I think, should cause all of us to pause and say, are we even using dignified sort of nomenclatures for basically a network of locally grounded reporters? And this is not just the Western media. I mean, I have to do a mea culpa here and say, even I, as a sort of city-bred reporter, when I go into a remote village in India, I am dependent on somebody who lives in that village, who may have nothing more than a phone, a smartphone, but understands that region, and I am dependent on her or him for my understanding, my access in that region. So I think this is an ethical question for all of us, irrespective of, you know, whose gaze it is on that story. This is, again, essentially about the asymmetry of power, about class, about structural inequality, and that plagues the media across the globe. But I want to make another point, you know. I feel that we act as if our multiple identities do not permeate into how we look at things. They do. So, you know, I am going to report as a woman, as an Indian, as a product of the many different impulses that have shaped me, as a global citizen, as a progressive. There are multiple identities, and your training as a journalist is to somehow transcend those identities and let the facts of the story be sacred. But the fact is that we're all looking through lenses, ways of seeing. John Berger's famous book, we all have ways of looking at the same facts. And the one way to address these sort of Western tropes about the global South is, I think, to have more of us tell our own stories. There's something very strange about the outside gaze looking in. If you let us tell our own stories, trust me, we're much more likely to be critical about what needs to be criticized than if we have the outsiders already wielding power, sometimes against our states, not governments, our countries. And then we're defensive, and we feel like we've got to stand up as Indians against this hypocrisy, etc. So let us tell our own stories.
Isn't that a slippery slope? Because then that can create the notion that only Indians can cover story from India, only Africans can cover stories from Africa, only Europeans can be based in
No, I'm not
Brussels.
saying can, but I'm saying that right now, traditionally, if you look at the two big, let's say, New York Times, Washington Post, if you look at The Economist, if you even look at, let's say, the BBC, Deutsche Welle, whatever, pick up any big global Reuters, right? I think Reuters does do a lot of local sort of hiring, at least in India. I have a number of colleagues who work with Reuters. But is it not true that it's essentially the gaze of another power structure, another culture, another socio-economic context, looking at my country, my people. I'm not saying that's not allowed, but I'm saying, are you grasping the texture, the nuance, the reality? For my country, for example, they say everything you say about India and its opposite is true. I don't see that multiple reality reflected in the Western media's coverage of my nation.
All right. So to Tomi, I asked, there's a really beautiful way that you phrase it, that we can't see ourselves. Brutus was also told the same in Julius Caesar. So whose job is it to point out the bias?
That's a good question. I think now that we've got a world where people can respond, social media has given the audience a bigger platform. We hear a lot from them, and they tell us what they want to hear. In fact, there used to be times when people would say in the newsroom that, oh, people don't care about this story, and people don't care about that. But now we see hashtags uniting people from around the world and people forming communities virtually across the world, and that tells us that we as the news have been detached from what people actually want to hear. And we're talking about, for example, representation. Okay, we do have representation on the ground many times, but how much representation do we have in the newsroom? How many editors have come from these places, from these different countries around the world, and made it up into the newsroom to be able to make decisions about, for example, how a story is covered, what story makes the top, the headlines in the news bulletin, and who, for example, it gets interviewed on a news topic. Many times when we're looking at different stories, I remember the malaria vaccine came up the other day and got approved, and all we heard was about the experts from different parts of the world. The Kenya Medical Research Institute was very heavily involved in that research. We didn't hear about them. We didn't see them being interviewed in the news. Where are they? They're erased. And so people from the global south end up being, victims and villains, but never experts. And that is part of that framework where even if we're saying we want to have representation within the newsroom, I think that spills over to even the kinds of output, the kinds of people we interview. Just one more thing. I remember when George Floyd, the killing happened the other day, suddenly all these black people on TV, and I'm like, where have these people been? And then now that George Floyd's story has vanished, all the black people are gone. So what's going on? And that really needs us to sit and think about what it is we're trying to do, what it is we're trying to tell the world.
By the way, I just want to point out that me and Tomi had been working for DW long before George Floyd happened, and we're still working at Deutsche Welle. But Alessandra, I'd like to find out, when the media gets it wrong, because we have put people on the air who have said preposterous things, and yet we don't take back our words. Why is that? Are we really incapable of self-reflection?
Goodness, I hope we are. Well, first of all, I just want to say I completely agree about the diversity inside, and then the making a real concerted effort to change and to look more deeply at who you speak to. Over the past year, and we're continuing it now, we introduced a global effort called Back to the Source, and the idea was every single reporter needs to reassess, replenish their sources to truly modernize and reflect and properly reflect the reality on the ground. And I think George Floyd was a huge wake-up call. And hopefully we have learned as to how unprepared many media organizations were in that coverage. To your question, one of the most important acts that a news organization can do to maintain itself as a trusted source of information is to recognize and correct its mistakes. And that includes mistakes that are made in the printed word, that are made on air, that are made even photographically or with captions that are wrong. So, this is something we take very, very seriously, to recognize and correct mistakes when we make them, because we are not perfect. Everybody makes mistakes. I hope, that the industry does so writ large, but it's very, very important.
David, I wanted to ask about sustained coverage of ongoing events such as disasters. I mean, you talked about food insecurity. That's one thing afflicting the African continent, but there's so many other disasters and crises that we could talk about. What can the media learn about sustaining coverage without boring people or desensitizing them?
Yeah, Edith, that's a significant issue because, you know, whether it's a Western audience or any audience from the South, one telecast or one media outlet covering something one time is only going to do so much. And you've got to, particularly when it's an issue that truly impacts society, you've got to sustain that momentum of the issue. I remember when Madagascar was beginning to have its famine, and it was climate impacted, climate change that brought it about. No one was giving it coverage at all. So what do you do as a leader? You jump on a plane, you fly there, and then you jump up and down and say, we got a crisis here, folks. I know what's going on in Ethiopia is getting all the, at the time, coverage, but don't forget about climate impact on the poorest of the poor, because the rest of the leaders were talking about climate mitigation. And I'm like, look, while you're working on climate mitigation caused by developed nations, what are you doing about climate adaptation so people can survive? And one story won't cut it. It takes multiple stories to sensitize a population to respond. And that's what happened there. The same thing in the Sahel. I went to the Sahel many times, including Sudan, and talking about the impact of ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Boko Haram. If we don't get ahead of this, it will absolutely destroy the population. And then you give anecdotal stories back to back over. I did this over 2 to 3 years, and it took several years before I could get the attention of global, particularly Western leaders, to realize that we've got solutions, but you're not providing them. And if you don't act, you're going to pay them 1,000 times more than if you did nothing, so to speak. And so anyway, I love this issue right here because this is where the coverage has got to be sustained coverage on issues that truly impact the world. And this is what was happening when COVID hit the scene and the world leaders were making decisions about COVID in a vacuum. And I went to the United Nations Security Council. Tony Blair had called me. He says, what are you seeing out there? And this was really in the first couple of months. And I said, Tony, I said, everybody's making decisions about COVID in a vacuum, and we are going to have a cure. This could be worse than the disease. So we've got to handle a hunger pandemic with the COVID pandemic, making strategic, balanced decisions so that we can move forward. And so when I went to the Security Council and we hammered the issue, how to balance these two issues together, and media coverage was really quite remarkable for about a couple of months there that allowed leaders to begin making more sustained, proper decisions that wouldn't shut down economies, wouldn't shut down supply chains and things like that.
Okay. We've only got 10 minutes, and I'd like to involve the audience in this discussion. Yes, we'll take 2 questions here, perhaps one on that side, and we've got one online. So as you're waiting for the microphone, news outlets, this is from Caroline, I dare not say the surname, from Switzerland. News outlets usually have to address the audience of the country they're from, yet their digital presence can turn that audience possibly into a global one. Still, this is not always reflected in their editorial direction. How do we reconcile this? Who wants to take that? Alessandra, go on.
Sorry, I actually moved. We lost audio for a second. Can you just ask that again quickly? In Teams, we lost audio a second.
Sure. News outlets usually have to address the audience of the country they're from, yet their digital presence can turn that audience possibly into a global one. But it's not always reflected in their editorial direction. How do we reconcile this?
Goodness. It's a very good question, and it's almost the question we grapple with every day. To me, a story, a coverage area, a topic that is relevant both locally, nationally, but then that can be explained in a way that it is relevant globally is the best story. And I think that it is possible to do so. And because all, but it is possible to do so by connecting. Often, if you take regions, something that is happening in one country is has an effect on the ground in a different way, but a similar phenomenon may be happening in a neighboring country, and I'm not making much sense here, apologies, but one of the ways that we do it, and I think this is an important point, is that we cover business. We're a news organization that covers, conflict, that covers general news, politics, society, but we also, a big part of what we do is covering financial news and business. And I think covering business news is a great way to talk about topics that are very relevant on the ground to people. So to humans that need to make decisions based on, for example, what does the oil price crisis mean now for me on the ground at the gas station? And that is true whatever country you are in, or in most countries that you are in. Inflation. What does this global inflation mean for me as a student in whatever country? It will be the effect will be different depending on what stage of your life in or where you live, but there will be an effect. So I feel that business stories are a great way to do it. And by the way, we were talking about Africa before. There are incredible business stories that we are doing across the continent. It's an area that we're spending a lot of resources on, and because again, you need to get beyond the traditional stories that are always told about one region or another.
All right, two questions from here. Yeah, please keep it brief.
I work for DW here, and I've worked in Pakistan for several years, so I've seen both sides. I agree with most of what the panelists are saying, but my question is, when countries like Pakistan, where strong actors control media, and even Pakistani public is not getting true facts, for me, somebody's like a layperson, I look at Western media because they are independent. They're not being influenced by local actors. And I have a question I maybe someone would like to answer. I think international media is predominantly run by Westerners. So there are not many local voices. There are not many Pakistani women journalists reporting about Pakistani women. So I think if that aspect can be looked into, maybe we could find a solution. Thank you.
Okay. Barkha, please take that very quickly.
Well, just to say that I understand the point you make about how there might be certain global media. I think we should start saying global media platforms instead of Western media platforms. There might be certain global media platforms that are freer sometimes than the media available in our own countries. But it still takes you to the question, who is telling the stories? So let's say there's X outlet that has more freedom than a lot of your Pakistan-based media organizations. Will they give you a chance to tell your story on that freer platform, or will they insist on it being their gaze? And I think it should at least be both.
Okay. Yes.
Well, I'm Peter Limburg. I'm the DG of W, and I first of all have to thank David for his work, and I'm really glad that you came here, even if it's only via the screen, but we really have to support your work, and I just want to ask you the question, what can international media do to support you? If we would be ferry now to, and you have a wish, what can we do?
Yeah, Peter, thank you. And you guys have been absolutely fantastic. And I wish I were there in person today, but I've actually got my international board meeting this weekend. The board meeting just started 20 minutes ago, so I got to get down there in just a minute. But I think the coverage and what you're doing, Peter, is extraordinary. And because when people understand the impact of hunger and what we're facing today, and this is where I think the media's got, because these are not just one 60-second story. what we're facing today, when you add it all up, I know in the last few months when a foreign minister or prime minister would call me and he says, I understand I need to talk to you to understand how deep and broad this problem really is, because you can pick one little problem out and give it coverage, but it doesn't give the breadth of how bad the situation really is and really is going to be for everybody. And so as we give it greater coverage in depth, the world begins to understand, wow, we do need to change. We do need to make some decisions. We've got icebergs out in front of the Titanic, and you've got a broken wine glass in the ballroom. And we are in such a time as this where we need to focus on the icebergs and not be so consumed with the broken tea glasses, because we've got serious issues ahead of us, Peter. So thank you very much. We look forward to working with you to get the message, the word out.
Great analogy. So unfortunately, I'm not going to take any more questions so that we can get solutions. That's all we have time for. Tomi, how do we change this around so that next year we're not discussing the same problem?
I think we need to do a lot more introspection of how we cover. I think journalists have this thing of a lot of self-patting on the back. Oh, you did so well, and I think we need to listen to our audiences. We need to review what it is that we're doing, even maybe get third parties to review what it is we're doing and look at the impact of our coverage. Many times I feel journalists are reporting for the newsroom, not for their audiences at home. Many times the stories we do, people don't care. I mean, ask your average person, your family members, ask them about the last story you did. They probably didn't watch it or read it because it doesn't matter to them. We are operating in different worlds, and I think we need to think and listen and put our ears on the ground and go out and have a feel for what is it that is going on in the world around us and tell those stories clearly, objectively, and without our own preconceived notions.
Okay, so David and Alessandra, I think, already gave us solutions earlier. The director in my ear is really pressing me for time. Barkha.
Yeah, I'll be quick. I think Tomi made a great point about deeper storytelling. And when I was listening to David, I was reminded of a 9-year-old boy that I met. I traveled across India reporting COVID. And I think David made such a great point that COVID was not just about a virus or a pandemic. It was about all of our socio-economic inequities that were deepened and wrenched open. And a 9-year-old kid that I met as he was walking home, there were millions of poor Indians who left the cities, daily wage workers, left the cities walking home to their villages at the height of the pandemic without food. And I asked a 9-year-old child playfully, do you know what coronavirus is? Joking, thinking he'd come up with some definition. And he said, yes. I said, what is it? He said, it means I don't have food. That's how he understood the virus. And so 3 solutions. Deeper storytelling. It doesn't matter who's telling the story. David, Alessandra, Tomi, Barkha, Edith. Deeper, more powerful storytelling, looking beneath the surface. Secondly, I urge editors of international media organizations, invite correspondents from countries that you normally post foreign correspondents in to come and report and comment on your countries. Do that. It'll immediately take away the sense of asymmetry and defensiveness that we feel. Call me in to do a piece on what's happening with abortion and women in the United States of America. Call me in to comment on why the US can't have a female president. And then I'll be much more receptive to your talking to me about the place of women in my country. And third, diversity, diversity, diversity. Not just at layer 1, but where the power is wielded. We need more of us where the power is wielded.
Yeah. Ladies and gentlemen, Barkha Dutt, David Beasley, Alessandra Galloni, Tomi Oladipo. Karoheni, wonderful.